Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the TCLF One-On-One series. Today, we have a fantastic guest with us to talk about an equally interesting theme, that is international trade. We have Ms. Divyashree Suri with us today. She is an associate at Lakshmikumaran and Sridharan, which is a top-tier law firm in India. She has passed out from Jindal Global Law School in Sonipat and has a beautiful blog of her own, WTO-Boutery Talk Global Trade, and she brings up with these very interesting posts and weekly updates regarding international trade on that blog. Ma'am, it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that really kind introduction. And like I've already told you, from one blog owner to another, I think your website is amazing. Should really keep up the good work. The hard work is really evident. Thank you. Thank you for having
Thank
me.
you. Thank you. That means a lot. Just to set the tone for the conversation, talking about blogs, you have set up a blog of your own, Talk Global Trade, and like what inspired you to start that blog? Was it always a part of the plan?
No, it was actually never a part of the plan. Except trade as a subject, um, it is multidimensional. The trade I practice, it is more along the lines of administrative law, right? I go to a tribunal, I represent domestic producers, I represent importers and exporters. I am mostly concerned with the trade remedy investigations which take place in India, right? Except trade law is so much more, right? It is you can't even begin to imagine the scope of trade law.
Right.
And one of the most beautiful parts about trade law is that it can be extremely academic in nature. It allows that space to be academic as well as mathematical, as well as like hard law. It is
Right.
all right. Uh, I was actually really intrigued by how the government, the General Agreement on Trade and Services works. GATS.
Right.
I feel like trade and services is such an important part of world trade generally, and I
Right.
feel like it's not being tapped into enough. I feel like there is a lot of scope to understand GATS and to really work on GATS. So you look at GATT, which is the General Agreement of Trade in Goods, right? It concerns
Right.
goods. It has several multilateral agreements which are attached to it. You read
Okay.
GATT with all of these multilateral agreements, right? Which you have TBT, you have SPS, you have rules of origin. You have your anti-dumping agreement. You have like these range of like agreements to look at while you're reading. With GATS, even though GATS provides for these agreements to exist, none of these agreements have really come into play, right? So I'm sorry, I digressed and went into that. But
Yeah.
when, uh, when I started reading about this, I wanted to write more about this, especially since the lockdown started. I started writing more, right? And this really fascinated me, and I wanted to write about it. But this is not something you can write in one 3,000 word paper and get it done with, right? This is like an entire pool of research which you actually need to. And being a working professional, you don't find the time to make these alternate commitments to a journal or some other person's blog, right? So I wanted to sort of start my own blog so that I could follow my passion project at my own pace. And it started with Gaps and Gats. That was my first series, and then it went on to I wanted to be updated with the weekly trade remedy updates. Right, there are investigations happening across the world, and I wanted to stay up to date so that I know what the new law is, and any trade nod would want to be up to date, right? That's something I could cover because I'm going through it myself anyway, right? So that is something to cover. I realized that since trade can be such an intimidating subject, especially something like dumping, right, where you have a normal value and you have landed value and you have injury margin and you have dumping margin, right? and your WTO panel reports and apple body reports are also a lot more they go into the jargon of it. So I wanted to break. I wanted to because when I spoke to my husband about trade, he'd always be like, and he's a lawyer himself, right? He just be like, break it to me. He please break it down to me. What is this? What is this normal value? So I should maybe I can simplify the law for people who are interested, like students who really want to explore that line, and really go into it. That's what the website gave me a platform and an opportunity to do so much more with the subject. I anyway so much. So yeah, that's what started my website.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Like when you prepare something like these weekly updates, and when you get to read more, other than the objective of presenting it to others and simplifying it for others, a very important part is that you start learning yourself as well, and you keep up to date because you're constantly at it and you're constantly updating yourself to create a better resource. So that's an important point there. And moving on in the conversation, we have seen that in the recent times, and this is a very popular topic, a lot of countries have started embracing protectionist measures, I should say, in order to boost domestic consumption of local goods, and also to promote this idea and concept of self-reliance. What are your views on this emerging trend of protectionist trade policies?
Yeah, absolutely right. Actually, the trend, the economic trend throughout the world was already moving towards sort of a protectionist edge, right? And the COVID just sort of hit everybody with the idea that they can get protectionist. I remember in the beginning there were around 60 countries which had imposed restrictions on medical equipment, and around 20 which had imposed restrictions on food, right? Um, I mean, obviously, it's bad, and it's while some protectionist measures, I won't call them protectionist measures, while some measures, some sort of restricting measures can be important at times. I mean, so the WTO provides for emergency provisions. Um, it's important to understand that the world needs to address the pandemic together. The 2000 recession is, I think, the finest example of how international cooperation, even if it's not perfect, right? How international cooperation can help countries overcome economic issues together. And so the import restrictions are, your outright restrictions on trade in goods. Countries doing other stuff like investments have become harder, right? It's harder to invest in certain countries, right? India has done it, EU is doing it, USA has done it, Canada has done it, Australia has done it. Everybody is making their investment rules a lot more stringent. That is also a blockage of trade, right? That does come under GATS. It's covered by GATS. It's also covered by TRIMS. TRIMS is also something which is not covered by this thing, right? That is a measure which countries are imposing. Countries are going out of their way so trade remedy measures are generally not protectionist per se, because they are sort of addressing only unfair imports. And unfair imports, I mean, restricting unfair imports is obviously in the you're looking at the benefit of your country when you are imposing trade measures. Except the country has no role to play. It's very few trade remedy investigations have been initiated suo motu, right? Most of these investigations are a result of the complaints filed by the domestic industry, right? Because the domestic industry is suffering. But what this leads to is that most of these trade remedy measures are mostly imposed on inputs, your raw materials, right? So your downstream industry first, right? Your downstream industry needs accessible raw material to then manufacture. So manufacturing isn't just limited to your raw materials. that raw material has to be used and consumed and then made into another product and then into another product and then into another product. So if you impose trade remedy measures on raw materials, your manufacturing industry will suffer. You will save that one particular industry, but the downstream industries will suffer.
Right.
You know, so it's important to sort of take these things into account.
Right.
And I think WTO has gotten tired of saying it. I mean, you look at its website; it's full of these reports on like how you should not be protectionist in this time. But it's just something. I think it's also the sort of time we were living in pre-COVID, right?
Right.
Pre-COVID, we were moving into a more protectionist regime. By we, I mean the world,
Right.
right? So I think COVID just hit it harder. It's important. It's important to understand that a pandemic cannot be fought alone. You will need to share medication. You will need to share food. If a vaccine is say, produced in Russia towards the
Right.
end, right, or EU or UK, right, and if they were to say, "Oh no, we are not going to share our vaccine," we're going to trade in the vaccine.
Right.
It's going to solve the pandemic. It's never going to work, right? Which is why I do think that the pandemic requires a more holistic approach than to go protectionist. A lot of countries have obviously acknowledged that. A lot of countries, Africa in particular, is entering into its end trade agreement. It's, I think there is a balance which needs to be struck. Where like, okay, I want my domestic industry to do well, but I also need to understand that for my domestic industry to do well, I need to trade.
Right.
That balance needs to be struck. You cannot block off imports and then expect, oh, the next day my domestic industry will be like flourishing. It won't. It won't be flourishing.
Right.
So yeah, like the Atmanirbhar thing which has been started by the government. They've not restricted any trade. They've not restricted any imports. Right? All they're going to do is they're going to boost the domestic industry. Right? They're going to boost manufacturing. They're going to, that's what's needed. You help for domestic manufacturing because that's super important. But don't block off other imports. It's not going to. It's not help. So.
And I think like that's a very important point that you've pointed out. Like in times like these, when we should appreciate global trade, and in these times of cooperation, these protectionist measures don't go a long way in helping the cause. And I think that's a very important point. Talking about trends, the technology is something that does not ever go out of the trend, and this pandemic has made us realize that even more. And in terms of law, technology has moved at a pace wherein it can be safely said that law hasn't been able to catch up the pace with which technology has been developing over the course of years. And even in trade, digital trade is increasingly is becoming increasingly popular. So, like, how does this all play out, the digital trade, and what is the role of WTO in it?
So actually, I was just thinking about this yesterday. Max Weber, a very famous philosopher, had pointed out he often criticized modernization, as in he would always tell you that if you are getting modern, there will be something you have to face. You have to face the music, right? So one thing he pointed out that as technology is going to improve, technology will become redundant. Human race will not sort of be able to catch up with it. They simply gave us that a coder learned the language, some coding language X, right? And he spent years of his life coding in that language, and all his work is in that language. And suddenly, code Y comes out, and that's the new trend, right? So, the coder who coded in language X, his entire work is redundant, right? It doesn't have meaning, and that's something that has been true, right? Like the radio was the thing, right? Back in like the 90s, right?
Right.
And suddenly radio was like, we don't want radio, we want TV, you know,
Right.
and TV went from Netflix, so it's been a bumpy ride, and you're right. You're right. I think till the 90s, 1997, the WTO was able to catch up a lot.
Right.
It's in the IT agreement, the Information Technology Agreement.
Right.
The tariffs for IT products were reduced zero. They were made zero.
Right.
Countries come to not imposing any duties on IT products because everybody should have access to IT products. If
Right.
I, as a developed country, have had access to all this fancy stuff,
Right.
developing countries too should have that access, right? That's the only way they'll grow. So they did have that. They did have the e-commerce
Right.
moratorium, right? Where they were like any uh, electronic transmission cannot be subjected to anti-dumping, to any duty, sorry, to any
Right.
duty, right? Uh, what's interesting is that they never really defined what an electronic transmission would mean, what would it encompass, right? And
Right.
they have working on it. There have been several working groups, there have been ministerial conferences
Right.
where the e-commerce situation has been brought up. But technology is also such a complex issue. It is not the
Right.
same for every country. It doesn't have the same meaning for every country. Its role in every country is not the same,
Right.
trade or otherwise. So, in that effect, countries have not really been able to reach an agreement on
Right.
what e-commerce should be and how should they go forward with e-commerce. Similarly, with the IT agreement, right? Um, they enlisted all the products which should have been there in 1997, right?
Right.
But 1997, man, I mean, we
Right.
did half of the new age products we have right now. What about them? You know?
Right.
So they have been trying for the expansion of the Information Technology Agreement. 15 countries, I think, did come together, but it's really had no effect because countries are not being able to decide on how technology should be taken forward. Because it has a different role for everybody. For example,
Right.
India got most of its indirect tax revenue from imports of, say, cassettes or
Right.
your hardware and audiovisual,
Right.
right? Suddenly everything's on Netflix. Suddenly everything's on
Right.
your platforms. Where does that revenue go? And you said that any electronic transmission cannot be subjected to a duty, right? India is bound by that. But hello,
Right.
what about my revenue? So
Right.
it's very interesting if you actually ever find the time to go into the details of digital trade. It is
Right.
actually very interesting, very complex because it's going to be different from each country's perspective. You
Right.
know. So yeah, that has been WTO has been trying. WTO has been trying really hard. And the ministerial conference, which was scheduled for this year, was supposed to address exactly that,
Right.
but it didn't take place, and now it's postponed for next year. Let's see,
Right.
maybe we reach a conclusion there.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And like another very important issue with regards to technology and digital trade has recently been the issue of India banning some Chinese apps in light of our border confrontations and strained relationships. In fact, today itself, some I guess 100 or some apps were again banned by the Indian government, and China has been constantly putting it out in the international media that India has violated its obligations under WTO and all of that, the issues surrounding the app ban. Like, what is your perspective on apps constituting goods and everything about that?
So, like I said, electronic transmissions haven't really been defined, right?
Right.
So you can't say if an app is an electronic transmission or not. And other than that, since this is not a concept, this is not a thing of duties, right? This is not about duties, it's about mere restriction.
Right.
There's a lot of conversation on whether apps fall under GATS at all. Because the way
Right.
I'm going to break this down into two issues. Okay? First, whether it is a violation at all or not. Uh, and secondly, if it's acceptable, even if it's a violation, right? So the way GATS works, right, is countries make commitments with regard to market access and national treatment in different sectors, right? You have the financial sector, you have the audiovisual sector, you have the tourism sector, right? So you have different sectors to which countries make commitments, right? But those are the only commitments they're bound by, right? You can't, unlike GATT, you make your you bind your tariffs for each product, and then you're sort of done, right? You just can't go beyond that bound tariff. With GATS, you make these exceptions in your commitments, right? Like you say, you can trade in services in the financial sector completely, subject to XYZ. That XYZ with their commitment, right? You cannot accept those things. You cannot restrict trade, uh, except they have made no such commitments for apps, right? That apps has never come up. It's never been committed to. So whether apps fall under the gaming sector and the GATS or not is. And apart from that, also, if I was to say that, okay, if I were to find a violation, right, the apps fall under different categories. For example, today PUBG has been banned, right, and Buddhism has been banned. Would would those apps constitute? Uh, would they fall under the gaming sector? Would they fall under the audiovisual sector? Would TikTok, for example, fall under the audiovisual sector? If you were to do it that way, maybe. But there is no fixed answer. You can't. There has been no conversation on it. So this actually falls really well with your technology moving faster than law question, because we don't know. We don't know if it's a violation or not. But yes, broadly speaking, with the broad principles of WTO in mind, sure, it is trade for sure, and you should not be discriminating when you're trading. So, I mean, it's really to see how a WTO panel would interpret this. Secondly, whether even if it's a violation, it's allowed or not, something which has been going around a lot is your national security exemption, right? They're saying that there's a border conflict, and India should get an exemption on the whole thing. It again, this depends on quite a few things. That if this does go to a WTO panel, whether India would be able to establish that there was an international relations emergency existing at that point of time, whether a border conflict is enough to establish that, with that is, I think, the larger issue. With regard to causal link, I think with the recent Qatar and Saudi Arabia panel report, and the slightly older Russian panel report, it is clear that the threshold which needs to be met, right, when you are trying to establish a causal link between a measure and the emergency at hand, is just that much that the measure should be such that it's enough to be able to make a causal link analysis. The threshold there is quite low, right? It isn't a difficult threshold to match. But again, if this was the first panel report where security exemption was rejected, and a lot of countries have been using the national security exemption for a number of things. So maybe the WTO is going to put its foot down and be like, no, You know, you can't
Right.
use security for everything. Or
Right.
maybe India will be able to prove that,
Right.
these are apps. They take data from her
Details
system,
and yeah. Yeah.
and China can use these details.
Yeah.
For example, right now, USA, right?
Right.
It banned TikTok because
Right.
it said
Right.
that USA, an American entity, does not own TikTok. It's not
Right.
going to happen. And China was like, cool, I'm going to make this process a lot harder than you thought it would be,
Right.
and it imposed like this approval process, right?
Right.
Which is not restriction per se, but yeah, I mean, countries are really like, fighting
Right.
each other on this. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting run for sure,
Right.
because tech is definitely a lot more important than we thought it was, say, 5 6 years ago with
Right.
apps and yeah, I mean, man, I shop everything from Amazon, right?
Right.
I watch all my movies on Amazon. It's important. It is an important instrument in trade right now. So I
Right.
think, yeah, it is about time that countries sort of embrace this, and let's see. Let's see what happens at the next ministerial conference. That should be a deciding factor for a lot of things, actually.
Right. And like this technology will play a bigger role in I think every law, intellectual property, trade law, everywhere it's going to come and it's going to pose some issues which need to be resolved faster because these issues continuously evolve with the evolution of technology. So yeah, let's see what happens there. And moving on to the last portion of our conversation, which relates to the dispute resolution mechanism under WTO. We know that in December 2019, the decision-making body came to paralysis, and to resolve that, some countries in April this year entered into multi-party interim arbitration agreement. So
Right.
what and but it has a very few members as of the moment, and many countries have not entered that agreement, including India. So, like, what are your views on this interim, relief, uh, I should say, dispute resolution mechanism, which will essentially provide relief to some countries?
Yeah, you're right, Shashwat. The dispute resolution mechanism is actually a very important part of the WTO, because while you still have your panel, which can make decisions, and those decisions will be binding on the countries, the countries in dispute, right? The appellate body gives a country who's not happy with the panel report a chance to sort of appeal, right? It gives
Right,
that recourse to the countries, which is, I think, an important one. Most disputes do go into the appellate body level, you know.
right,
So it also allows countries to sort of apply for a compliance panel and then a compliance appellate body. That
right,
entire process is a very important one, and with the appellate body being paralyzed, a lot of important decisions are now hanging. They are
right,
it's they're in a limbo. You can't do anything
right,
about them. So yeah, while the MPIA is extremely important, right? And it is
right,
a brilliant use of Article 25 of the DSU, right?
right,
Article 25 of the DSU allows countries to arbitrate with each
right,
other if they don't want to go through the whole dispute resolution process, like the institutional dispute resolution process. And I think
right,
that the agreement is a wonderful recourse under that. The appellate body still holds its own value and its own position. You know, so sure, a lot of countries not uh, joining the MPI can also have a lot of strategic value to it, because
right,
if a panel has held in favor of a country, uh,
right,
they will want the other country to adopt it,
right,
right? But if the other country against whom the panel report is, they have appealed the panel report when there is no appellate body, they're not supposed to they're not bound by the panel report,
Right.
right? So, for example, India's export subsidy panel report, right? When the
Right.
panel says that India's export subsidies are a problem, it makes sense for India to not join the MPIA because they are like, I have appealed it. I
Right.
don't need to get rid of my export subsidies now.
Right.
And when the appellate body comes, we'll see. Maybe they say that my export subsidies are absolutely fine. In which
Right.
case, I don't need to remove them. You know.
Right.
So it buys countries that fine. Uh,
Right.
a lot of times those are factors which play into not joining the MPIA. But
Right.
again, like I said, there could be a situation where countries are on the other side, where they
Right.
want a panel report to be adopted. They want compliance on that panel report, in which case they will need some mechanism.
Absolutely.
And I think the MPI is a great solution, even if a temporary. It is a great
Right.
solution to the appellate body is back into action.
Right.
Like I said, the trade law is constantly evolving. It is constantly growing into something you probably hadn't imagined a day before, and suddenly that's what the story is today. And generally speaking, I think countries are moving towards um, a more FTA agreement based model than
Right.
having one institution govern them all.
Right.
Like I spoke about GATS as well, right? A lot of the GATS provisions are now incorporated in FTAs. A lot of digital trade is now incorporated in FTAs. You
Right.
know, because that the deadlock which is being reached between countries now, it
Right.
it seems like FTAs are the preferred form of trade governance between countries right
Right.
now. So maybe the MPI becomes a permanent solution. You can't tell.
Right.
So I think I think it's just going to be a matter of time before we actually know the
Right.
importance of any set of agreement.
I think we'll probably see the growth of trade-related arbitration in the coming
Yeah.
future, other than this contract and commercial-based arbitrations. Apart from that, so yeah, thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us today. It was an enlightening conversation, to say the least, and you've covered some of the most recent issues with absolute simplicity, and I think that was a great part of this conversation. Thank you once again.
It was a pleasure being here. You guys are absolutely wonderful in what you do. Keep it up. Thank you so much for having
Thank
me.
you.